The first thing I noticed when I stepped into the kitchen was the empty space on the counter where my morning pills were supposed to be. The small tray I always kept by the kettle sat bare, the faint outline of dust marking where each bottle normally rested. A quiet unease settled in my chest as I looked around, expecting to see them moved somewhere obvious. Nothing felt out of place, except the one thing that mattered. Before I could call out, I heard my son's voice slip through the half-closed door to the hallway, low and urgent, as if he didn't want the walls to hear. That whisper carried the first sign of danger. He said, "Let nature decide. He doesn't need those anymore." The words landed with a cold finality that tightened the room around me. I stood still, listening to the silence that followed, the kind that settles when someone believes they've spoken too loudly. His tone wasn't careless. It was calculated, almost relieved, as though a decision had been made long before I woke. I waited a few seconds before moving, forcing my breathing to stay steady so he wouldn't hear the change in it. When he stepped into the kitchen, he hung up quickly and placed his phone on the table, screen down. He offered a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes, his gaze slipping past mine instead of meeting it. He said he had cleaned things up to make the space safer for me, using the same gentle, practiced voice he always used when explaining things he'd already decided. I asked about the missing pills, keeping my tone even, and he shrugged, saying he was reorganizing them. The way he avoided looking at the empty counter told me he wasn't reorganizing anything. He moved around the kitchen with a calm that felt out of place, opening drawers he didn't need to open, adjusting items that never bothered him before. There was something intentional in the way he created small noises, as if he wanted to make the room feel busy enough that the missing bottles seemed like a small inconvenience instead of a deliberate act. Each motion pulled the unease deeper into my awareness. I watched his hands, noticing how he kept them away from the drawer where I expected the medication to be hidden. He insisted he was helping, but the word didn't sit right. It felt like a cover for something heavier, something he didn't want to explain. His face stayed calm, but his shoulders carried tension, tight, wired, ready. The absence of those bottles suddenly felt larger than the counter itself. I sensed a line had been crossed, but I didn't know yet which side of it either of us stood on. I asked again where he put them, and this time he only gestured vaguely toward the pantry, never turning his head to check. I opened the pantry myself, letting the cool air drift out as I scanned the shelves. Cereals, canned soup, tea boxes, rice, no bottles. My son stayed behind me, his silence firm enough to feel like a hand pressing against my back. The confusion mixed with something sharper, something close to alarm, but I kept it buried. Men my age learn to stay quiet when answers look dangerous. I closed the door slowly and turned to find him watching me with a steady, unreadable expression. He stepped forward with a mug in his hand, steam rising just enough to fog the space between us. Instead of the medication I needed for my morning dose, he offered the tea and said it would settle everything better than pills ever could. His voice carried a soft insistence, the kind that leaves no room for disagreement. When I didn't reach for it immediately, he lifted the mug closer and told me to trust him. I took the cup, feeling the heat press against my palm, and the room felt suddenly smaller. Trust wasn't supposed to feel like this. I sat at the table with the untouched mug in front of me, letting the steam fade as I tried to steady the day in my mind. My life had been simple for years. Quiet mornings, steady routines, and the slow, comforting work of repairing old watches in the small room I kept behind the living area. After retiring, that rhythm became my anchor. My wife had passed 8 years earlier, leaving a soft emptiness in the house, but I learned to live inside that space without expecting more from anyone. My son visited when he could, which wasn't often, though I never held it against him. Distance becomes normal when life grows in different directions. When my heart condition surfaced a few months ago, everything changed, not because of the illness itself, but because of his sudden presence. He started showing up more, calling more, offering help in a way that felt slightly out of tune with the years before. At first, I took it as a sign of care, maybe the kind that arrives late but arrives all the same. But something in his voice always felt a step too smooth, the way he asked questions that sounded memorized rather than felt. It was attention, yes, but it carried a strange polish, like he was performing concern instead of living it. I thought about the comments he used to make whenever medicine came up, lines he threw out casually without knowing how sharply they would echo later. "Medicine makes you weak," he said once when I told him about a prescription for blood pressure. Another time he claimed doctors don't know everything and that the body knows how to fix itself if you let it. Back then, I chalked it up to his opinions, the kind adults form online or overhear from someone loud enough to sound convincing. I didn't argue, I just listened. But now those comments didn't feel harmless. They felt like small threads that, when pulled together, made a larger shape I hadn't noticed. The distance between us over the years had grown in quiet ways. Missed holidays, brief phone calls, hesitations when talking about anything personal. We never fought, but we never truly connected either. I assumed time would bridge that gap. Instead, it deepened. Widening with each year, I spent adjusting to life alone. I told myself he was busy, that young men carry burdens they don't always name. It was easier than asking questions that might lead nowhere. When he reappeared so suddenly after my diagnosis, I wanted to believe it was love. I let myself accept the shift without looking closely at it. But as he moved around my home these past few weeks, the changes in his behavior didn't match the history between us. His gestures were helpful, yes, but they came with a stiffness beneath them, a watchful edge, as if he was waiting for something more from each visit than a simple check-in. The first clear crack appeared on a Tuesday afternoon when he handed me my pill box and told me the doctor had changed the dosage. He spoke with confidence, repeating it as though he had memorized the instruction word for word. I thanked him, trusting the information, because trusting your own children feels natural, even when the ground under that trust has thinned. Later that evening, the clinic called with my lab results, and when I asked about the dosage change, the nurse paused, checked my file, and said no adjustments had been made. It wasn't a small mistake. It wasn't confusion. It was intentional. I sat with that knowledge quietly, letting its weight settle in a way that didn't draw attention. The contradiction didn't explode into fear or anger. It just shifted something inside me, tilting the balance between trust and doubt. His concern no longer felt warm. It felt designed. A part of me pulled back without showing it, the instinct older men learn when words don't match actions. By the time I returned to the kitchen that night, the missing pills and the whispered call no longer felt like separate moments. They felt like pieces of the same picture, one I had been too hopeful to see until now. I noticed the shift a few days later when he took the pill box from my hand before I could open it. He said he'd organize everything to avoid confusion, using the same calm tone people use when speaking to someone who can't keep track of their own life. He arranged the bottles on the counter, labeling them with neat strips of tape, then moved them to a shelf I couldn't reach without stretching. He explained it as a safety measure, but the way he positioned himself between me and the medication felt less like help and more like possession. I didn't argue. I simply nodded, letting the scene fold into place, while something unsettled began to take shape inside me. Later, when he stepped out to answer a call, I went to check the trash before the bin was taken out. The lid opened with a soft creak, and right there among the paper towels and food scraps were 2 of my pill bottles. Both were full. Both still carried the pharmacy labels from last week. I lifted them slowly, feeling the weight of the unused pills pressing against the sides. The trash bag rustled under my hand, sounding louder than it needed. 2, and I closed it quietly before he returned. I stood there for a moment, letting the realization settle, not in panic, but in a cold, quiet understanding that something deliberate was happening. The next morning, my neighbor stopped me outside to ask how I was feeling. He mentioned my son had told him I'd been getting forgetful lately. He said it gently, with concern, but the word sat in the air like a small bruise forming under the skin. Forgetful. The same word my son had hinted at in small ways, correcting details from stories I told, finishing sentences as though I was struggling, reminding me of events we both knew I hadn't forgotten. It wasn't a blunt accusation. It was a slow shaping of an image, one conversation at a time. That afternoon, while looking for my grocery list on my phone, I noticed something else. The reminder app I relied on for my medication schedule was gone, not hidden, deleted. I searched through the settings, checking if it had been moved or archived, but it wasn't anywhere on the device. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't changed anything. The absence wasn't an accident. It was another adjustment made without my knowledge, quiet enough that I wouldn't notice right away. I held the phone for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the app icon should have been. When my son returned later, He moved around the house with the same organized confidence he'd shown all week. He picked up magazines from the table, straightened a stack of mail, checked the pantry, and offered commentary on things I hadn't asked his opinion on. Each action carried a subtle message, that he was the one holding things together, that I was slipping into something he needed to manage. He corrected a small detail I mentioned about a conversation with the doctor, adjusting my memory as though tuning a dial. His tone was gentle, almost rehearsed, the kind used by someone trying to make their version of events sound like the only reasonable truth. I watched him closely for the first time, not as a father watching his son, but as a man trying to understand another person's intentions. His movements had a pattern, his words a rhythm, his presence a quiet pressure. None of it matched the history between us. The more I observed, the clearer the pattern became. He wasn't reacting to my condition. He was shaping it, guiding it, building something around me in ways subtle enough to escape notice unless I looked directly at them. So I did. I watched without speaking, listened without responding, and let each small detail settle into a place that formed a clearer picture than any explanation he had offered. The shift wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, and it was growing. The next morning, after he left to pick up a few things, I opened the cabinet where I kept my important papers. I hadn't checked it in weeks, trusting his word that the bills were handled and everything was up to date. The folders were still lined up neatly, but the weight of the first one felt wrong. Inside, I found envelopes stamped overdue, each one untouched. Electricity, insurance, property tax. Every bill he said he had already taken care of. The dates stretched back farther than I expected. I stood there with the folder open, letting the truth settle in silence. It wasn't neglect, it was effort. Planned, concealed, executed with calm hands. I moved to the next drawer, checking for anything else that didn't belong. That was when I found the printed packet tucked under a stack of manuals. It was titled, Restorative Cleansing Regimen, filled with herbal mixtures and fasting cycles. Each page listed steps that looked harmless until I reached the section with warnings. Small notes at the bottom mentioned risks for people with heart conditions, risks severe enough to make my fingers stop on the page. The packet wasn't just misguided advice, it was dangerous, and it had been hidden among things he assumed I wouldn't touch. Later that afternoon, the home nurse stopped by for her weekly visit. She was new, polite and observant. My son hovered close to her, following her into the kitchen, then the living room, asking questions that didn't match her task. He pressed her about DNR rules, how they worked, who signed them, what authority family members had. His tone wasn't curious. It was searching, like he was trying to understand how decisions would be handled when I couldn't answer for myself. The nurse paused more than once, glancing toward me as if checking whether I was comfortable with the direction of the questions. When she left, he intercepted her at the door, whispering something I couldn't hear. His posture was tight, his voice low, his questions too urgent to fit the polite smile he tried to maintain. She gave him short answers, none of them satisfying him, and he watched her walk down the sidewalk as if he needed to make sure she didn't come back with a story I hadn't approved. As the week went on, he became more involved with my phone than I was. He would reach for it the moment it buzzed, scanning the caller ID before deciding whether to hand it to me. Many times he answered for me, telling the person I was resting or not feeling well enough for confusion. Once, when I tried to return a neighbor's call, he said the phone company had been acting up, even though the screen showed a missed call seconds old. The more I observed him, the more it became clear he wasn't helping manage anything. He was filtering my world through his hands. His insistence on natural recovery began to harden, too. At first, it sounded like an opinion, the way some people avoid medication out of preference. But now, he delivered his ideas like instructions. He urged me to stop poisoning my body with chemicals, suggesting teas and supplements he claimed would rebuild strength faster. He repeated lines about nature knowing what to do, using the same phrasing he had whispered on the phone the morning the pills vanished. Each time I mentioned feeling dizzy or short of breath, he shifted uncomfortably, brushing it off, as if acknowledging my symptoms would undermine whatever plan he had settled on. The irritation surfaced gradually. A tight exhale when I asked about the medication, a forced smile when I mentioned calling the clinic, a clipped response when I said the nurse wanted to check on me again. None of it was loud, none of it was openly hostile. But each reaction carried the weight of someone who needed the situation to move in one direction, the one he chose. not the one my health required. By the end of the week, the things he hid weren't buried in drawers or whispered behind doors. They were in his posture, his timing, his hands hovering too close to the parts of my life that kept me standing. Pieces that once seemed harmless, now aligned into a pattern I couldn't ignore. And with each passing day, the shape of his intentions grew clearer. I woke in the middle of the night to the low murmur of his voice drifting down the hallway. The house was quiet except for that sound, a soft, urgent tone that didn't match the calm fronts he showed me during the day. I stayed still, listening through the half-open bedroom door. His words were clearer this time, stripped of the careful polish he used when speaking to me. "He won't last long without them," he said. The sentence came out steady, almost calculated, as if he was stating a fact rather than a risk. A cold heaviness settled in my chest, not from my condition, but from the clarity of what I'd just heard. When he ended the call, I listened to the soft click of drawers opening in the living room. By the time I stepped out and walked toward him, he had already tucked an envelope into his back pocket. He turned sharply when he saw me, forcing a smile that landed too late. He claimed he was sorting mail, but his hand stayed pressed over the hidden letter, fingers curled tight around the folded paper. I watched the tension in his shoulders as he changed the subject, guiding me back toward the kitchen as if moving me away from something fragile. His steps were careful, rehearsed, the way someone walks when they're guarding more than just paper. The next morning, after he left to buy groceries, I checked the small drawer by the entryway, the one where mail normally accumulated. Only a few circulars remained. The rest had been removed recently. The dust outline on the wood showed that clearly. I opened the trash bin, lifting the bag gently so it wouldn't tear. Beneath the food scraps and packaging were pieces of shredded envelopes. Each strip carried part of a logo. Insurance companies, medical offices, specialist centers. I sifted through slowly, finding warning notices cut into thin ribbons. One piece carried the unmistakable blue border of a cardiologist's letter. Another had the word urgent, sliced neatly down the middle. I set the pieces down on the counter, letting the weight of them settle inside me. They weren't thrown away by accident. They were removed to keep me from seeing them. I checked the drawer again and found nothing left except a single pamphlet he planted earlier in the week about herbal recovery. The real medical warnings, the ones meant for me, had been destroyed. He returned in the afternoon with the same composed confidence he always brought after hiding something. He placed a packet on the table, sliding it toward me with a seriousness that pressed the air thin. "It's just a form," he said. "A consent for alternative treatment. It'll help you avoid the side effects from the pills." He spoke with a steady voice, but his eyes carried a restless push, the kind of pressure people use when they need agreement more than understanding. He tapped the line where the signature belonged, waiting for my hand to move. I didn't reach for the pen. I watched the corners of his mouth tighten, watched the patience drain from his expression, revealing the frustration beneath. His voice dropped into a strained tone as he told me I owed him trust after everything he sacrificed. The word owed hung between us with a weight I hadn't felt before. It wasn't the voice of a caregiver. It was the voice of someone convinced he had earned control over the outcome. He paced once, then turned back, leaning closer, insisting he knew what was best. The room felt smaller with each word he delivered, the shadows stretching across the walls as the day dimmed. There was no anger in me, only a growing clarity, a slow, steady understanding that the pieces I'd gathered weren't isolated. They formed a single truth, sharpened now by his urgency. His care wasn't kindness. His guidance wasn't concern. Every step he took had been shaped by control, built on decisions he made without me, around me, and against me. I felt the shift settle inside me, cold and exact, as he pushed the form toward me again. Trust was never part of his plan. The home nurse arrived earlier than usual the next morning, her expression more focused than the polite calm she normally carried. She checked my blood pressure twice, comparing the numbers with the notes in her tablet. When she moved to the kitchen to gather my medication list, she paused at the empty spot on the counter where the bottles should have been. Her eyes shifted toward me, then toward the cabinet, and she asked quietly if anything had changed. I didn't offer details, only said the pills weren't where I left them. She pressed her lips together, made a short note, and stepped outside to call her supervisor. Her voice was low, but her tone had the clipped precision of someone documenting a risk. Not long after she left, my phone rang. The caller ID showed the clinic's main line. My doctor spoke with an urgency I hadn't heard from him before, his tone stripped of the usual small talk. He asked if I'd missed any doses, then told me plainly that stopping my heart medication without medical instruction was life-threatening. He said he had reviewed my recent readings, and something didn't line up with the treatment plan he set. There was no accusation in his voice, only concern sharpened by the seriousness of what he suspected. He told me he wanted to see me at the clinic as soon as possible, even offering to arrange transportation. After the call, I contacted the pharmacy to check whether refills were ready. The pharmacist hesitated, then explained that several refill requests had been canceled by a family member acting on your behalf. I asked who made the cancellations, and she read the notes softly, confirming my son's name. She apologized, saying she assumed the instruction came from me. I thanked her, keeping my voice steady, even as the words sank in, layer by layer. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't misunderstanding. Someone had gone out of their way to prevent medication that kept me alive from reaching my hands. Later that afternoon, the nurse returned with her supervisor, both carrying the same composed seriousness. They asked if they could review my care plan with me, speaking carefully so their questions didn't feel like accusation. The supervisor explained that during the last visit, my son had asked whether I was experiencing mental decline and if it should be noted in their records. She said it gently, but the weight behind the information landed with precision. The question hadn't been medical. It had been preparation aimed at reshaping how others viewed my capability. The supervisor continued, explaining that several providers had flagged inconsistencies, missed medications, contradictory explanations about my condition, canceled refills, and unusual inquiries about DNR documentation. Each piece formed a pattern they could no longer ignore. Their tone stayed calm and professional, but the message was unmistakable. What I suspected silently now had the shape of something verified. The nurse glanced toward the front window, checking the driveway, as if making sure the conversation remained private. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice while keeping it firm. She told me that based on everything recorded, the safest option was for me to stay somewhere my care couldn't be interfered with, either under direct medical supervision or with someone the clinic trusted. The words were careful, measured, and free of dramatics. They weren't suggesting caution anymore. They were advising protection. I sat with their recommendation in the quiet that followed, letting the truth settle without panic. Fear didn't rush in. It arrived slowly, shaped by clarity. The pieces I had gathered over the past days aligned seamlessly with what these professionals now confirmed. Whatever line my son had been walking, he had crossed it. They stood before me with the steady posture of people, trained to deliver hard truths, and I understood the meaning behind their final words. This was the point of no return. I spent the next morning moving slowly through the house, choosing each action with the kind of care older men reserve for situations that can no longer be ignored. I gathered the documents I still trusted, insurance papers, bank statements, identification, and placed them in a small envelope I kept tucked beneath a stack of old watch manuals. I left the rest where they were, knowing he expected to find everything untouched. Before he woke, I called the clinic from the porch and arranged for a backup supply of my medication to be held under my name only. The doctor agreed without hesitation, his voice steady but firm, as if he understood more than he could say over the phone. When I walked back inside, he was already in the kitchen, pacing with a restless energy he tried to hide by pretending he was organizing the counter. He asked where I had gone, his tone light, but laced with a sharpness that hadn't been there weeks ago. I told him I'd stepped out for air. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion exactly, but in a way that showed he sensed something shifting. He hovered near me the rest of the morning, adjusting objects I didn't need adjusted, standing a little too close, offering help before I could finish simple tasks. He followed me from room to room, asking questions about how I was feeling, pressing his hand against my back as if guiding me toward the chair he wanted me to sit in. When I didn't respond with the gratitude he expected, he sighed loudly and leaned against the counter, shaking his head. "I'm doing everything alone," he said, the words heavy with accusation. "You think I want to deal with all this?" His voice wasn't raised, but the edge was unmistakable. He wasn't asking for comfort. He was demanding compliance. Later in the afternoon, my neighbor knocked at the door, bringing soup the way she did every few weeks. Before I could stand, he intercepted her, opening the door only wide enough to slip through. I heard him telling her I was resting and shouldn't be disturbed. His tone was polite but firm, leaving no room for her to question him. The door closed quickly, and he returned to the living room with an expression that carried a warning, one he didn't bother putting into words. A similar thing happened when a friend from church called to ask if he could stop by. My son answered the phone before I could reach it, telling the man it wasn't a good time. The walls of the house felt tighter with each visitor turned away, but I didn't push back. I watched, listened, and let every piece fall into place. His control wasn't loud. It was methodical, built through interruptions, diversions, and soft-spoken barriers. That evening, while he was checking the mail, I decided to test the tremor beneath his calm. When he came back inside, I mentioned casually that the home nurse had requested a private follow-up with me next week. I said it with an even tone, without suspicion, as though it meant nothing. His reaction broke through the surface faster than I expected. His eyes widened, his shoulders stiffened, and he asked 3 times why she needed to see me alone. His questions came too quickly, his voice thinner than usual, and he paced the room with a tightness in his movements that exposed a fear he hadn't meant to show. I kept my posture relaxed, offering no explanation beyond what I'd already said. He tried to regain his composure, forcing a smile that faltered as soon as he turned away. He started cleaning the table again, wiping the same spot over and over, pretending he wasn't rattled. But the mask had cracked. The calm he wore so easily before no longer fit him. For the rest of the night, I acted compliant, accepting the tea he made, answering his questions with short nods, letting him believe I was slipping back into the rhythm he preferred. Inside, though, something had settled into place, steady and immovable. I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't uncertain. I was preparing. He came into my room long after the house had gone still, the door opening just wide enough for him to slip through. The overhead lights stayed off. Only the hallway glow traced a sharp outline around the stack of papers in his hand. He didn't try to soften his expression this time. He set the documents on the bedside table, straightening them with slow, deliberate movements. "We need to finish this," he said quietly. "Tonight." His tone wasn't calm. It was tight, impatient, carrying the weight of something that had been building too long. He pulled a chair close, sitting so near I could feel the tension in the air between us. He pointed to the signature line with a shaky finger and said he couldn't keep carrying everything if I wouldn't cooperate. When I didn't reach for the pen, he exhaled sharply, rising from the chair and pacing beside the bed. "I can't take care of you if you won't help yourself," he said, his voice cracking in small places he didn't notice. The sentence wasn't emotional, it was transactional, the way someone speaks when their patience is tied to an outcome, not a person. He reached for my drawer next, opening it with a practiced motion, scanning for the medication the clinic had secured for me. When he didn't see the bottle right away, he rummaged through the contents with growing urgency. His movements were quick, restless, more frantic than he wanted to appear. I watched him quietly, letting the moment unfold. He pulled the bottle out at last, gripping it tightly as if removing it would solve the entire problem. "These are hurting you," he said without turning around. "You don't need them." I sat up slowly, enough to shift the air in the room, and placed the envelope I had prepared earlier on the blanket beside me. He turned when he heard the soft rustle, his expression tightening when he saw the papers sliding into view. I opened the envelope and laid out the items inside one by one. The doctor's written message warning that medication interruptions were life-threatening. The refill log showing cancellations made under his name. The shredded mail pieces I had pieced together on the counter. I didn't speak. I didn't accuse. I just let him see them. His face drained of its practiced confidence. He stepped back once, then again, as if the evidence carried a force he hadn't prepared to confront. "You don't understand what I've been dealing with," he said, his voice lifting in pitch but not volume. He grabbed the edge of the bed frame, steadying himself, then shot a glance at the papers as if they were the cause of everything unraveling. "I've been trying to fix this. You keep ruining everything." His words weren't shouted. They cracked under the strain of a plan collapsing in front of him. He reached for the documents, as if he could gather them and make them disappear, but his hand trembled too much to follow through. His breathing quickened, uneven and sharp, and he paced the room in tight, jittery circles, muttering fragments about sacrifices, stress, and how none of this was supposed to happen. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was desperation, raw and unguarded, spilling out in ways he couldn't control. The sound of his voice carried farther than he realized. A knock echoed through the hallway before either of us reacted. My neighbor, who lived close enough to hear the sharp edges of the exchange, called out my name. When my son didn't answer, she pushed the door open, her eyes scanning the scene, the scattered papers, the pill bottle clenched in his hand, my posture on the bed. Her face tightened with instant understanding. She stepped inside with steady authority, positioning herself between us without hesitation. "I'm calling for help," she said, her voice calm but firm. She didn't wait for permission. She dialed immediately, speaking in clear, measured sentences as she described the situation. My son froze, the color draining from his face, his hand loosening around the medicine bottle. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply stepped back, lowering his gaze as if the room itself had turned against him. The tension that had filled the air for weeks finally broke, not with a dramatic moment, but with a simple, undeniable truth laid bare under the dim hallway light. The police arrived quickly, their radios crackling softly as they stepped into the house. They didn't come in with noise or force, just calm, steady movements that filled the space with a level of authority neither of us could ignore. One officer guided my neighbor aside to take her statement, while the other approached my son, asking him to sit at the dining table. My son tried to explain himself at first, speaking fast, tripping over words that only tangled tighter the more he pushed them out. The officer listened without interrupting, taking notes with the quiet patience of someone who has seen this pattern before. When they turned to me, their questions were simple and direct. Was I aware my medication had been withheld? Had any refills been canceled without my consent? Had I been pressured to sign forms I did not understand? I answered each question plainly. There was no anger in my voice, just the steady truth of what had unfolded in the past weeks. One officer wrote everything down, pausing only to confirm dates, times, and details. My son watched from across the room, his shoulders sinking lower with each answer I gave. After reviewing the evidence I had set aside, the doctor's message, the pharmacy logs, the shredded mail, the officers spoke with him again. Their tone shifted, not harsh, but formal. They explained the charges under review: reckless endangerment for interfering with life-preserving medication, medical interference for canceling refills, and attempted coercion for pressuring me to sign treatment consent forms. Each charge carried its own quiet weight. My son rubbed his temples, staring at the table as if trying to understand how he had ended up cornered by his own choices. The officers stepped outside with him while calling their supervisor, leaving me with the neighbor until the situation was formally processed. She sat beside me, not speaking, just offering a steady presence while I tried to breathe through the mix of clarity and sorrow forming in my chest. After a few minutes, the officers returned and informed me that my son would not be allowed to remain in the home for the time being. They escorted him out calmly, letting him gather only the belongings he came with. He didn't look back when he stepped onto the porch. The door closed behind him with a finality that echoed deeper than the sound itself. Later that afternoon, a medical team arrived to record everything officially. The nurse who had noticed the missing pills earlier in the week corroborated her notes, adding them to the file. A clinician reviewed my vitals again, confirming that the disruption in medication had put me at real risk. Their questions were factual, their tone professional, but I could sense the concern beneath it. They documented each incident carefully, building a record that left no room for doubt. A social worker came shortly after, carrying a binder of forms meant to help me restore full authority over both my medical decisions and my finances. She guided me page by page, explaining each section in clear, simple language. I signed the necessary papers without hesitation, feeling a small measure of stability return with every completed line. She ensured that my son was removed from all access lists, medical portals, insurance records, emergency contacts, and pharmacy permissions. She also arranged temporary oversight for my medication until the clinic could assign the next steps. By evening, the house felt still again, but not in the unsettling way it had before. The quiet now carried a strange steadiness, as though the walls themselves were finally able to rest. I sat in the back room where I used to repair watches, letting my hands rest on the wooden table worn smooth from years of steady work. The betrayal wasn't loud. It didn't move through me in waves. It settled slowly, like dust after a long day. touching every corner of the room with a heaviness that didn't need explanation. There was no victory in what happened, no relief, just a grounded acceptance that some truths cost more than others. I sat there in the stillness, letting the weight of it settle without trying to soften it, knowing this was the closest thing to closure I would ever get. I spent the days that followed sitting in the quieter corners of my home, letting the silence settle without trying to fill it. The house felt different now, not safer, not warmer, just more honest. I found myself replaying moments I once brushed aside, moments that look different when you finally see them without the lens of hope. Love has a way of softening a man's sight, especially as he ages. I ignored signs, not because I was blind, but because I wanted to believe my son reached for me out of care, not calculation. That hope kept me from looking closely at the things that didn't fit. It kept me still when I should have stepped back. Over time, I began to understand that danger doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it grows in the quiet spaces, small comments, subtle control, decisions made on your behalf when no one is watching. Entitlement doesn't start with big gestures. It starts with tiny steps, each one small enough to excuse, each one easy enough to overlook. By the time you recognize the pattern, it has already wrapped itself around the parts of your life you thought were safe. That realization didn't bring anger. It brought clarity, sharp, steady, undeniable. I learned more in the past few weeks than I had in the 8 years since my wife passed. I learned that medical decisions must stay in your hands, no matter how much you trust the person standing beside you. I learned that documents, every signature, every form, every bottle, hold more power than we expect, and they can be used against us if we stop paying attention. And I learned that instinct is a quiet voice, one that speaks softly at first, asking you to notice what doesn't feel right. When a man reaches his final third of life, that voice should be the first one he listens to. Healing, I've come to understand, doesn't come from pulling people back into your life simply because they share your blood. It comes from creating boundaries strong enough to keep the harm out, even when the harm comes from someone you raised. I didn't forgive him. I didn't search for reasons or excuses. Some actions carved too deep to mend. Instead, I chose distance, not out of resentment, but out of respect for the years I still have ahead of me. Peace grows in that distance. Strength, too. I secured my documents, set up protections with the clinic, arranged trusted contacts who understand my needs without trying to shape them. I rebuilt the parts of my life that were unsettled, not with fear, but with a quiet respect for what had almost been taken. Each step was small, practical, grounded, exactly the kind of strength old age teaches you to value. Now, when I sit in my repair room and feel the familiar weight of an old watch in my hands, I understand something I wish I had known sooner. Trust is not something you give freely just because years have passed between you and someone else. Trust is something earned and maintained, even within a family, especially within a family. So if there is one thing worth saying to anyone who may walk a similar road, it is this. Listen to your instincts, protect your decisions, and guard what carries your name. Love your family, but never give anyone the keys to your life.